Okay, we are live.
We are.
And welcome to Mentionables Live. Tonight, we discuss Ravi Zacharias and the recent report that came out regarding his sexual misconduct. So we're going to dive in and take a good look at a number of angles on this from a number of different perspectives. So before we dive into this deep topic, just going to do some introductions. I'm Caleb Johnston. Over here to my right is
Joel Furches.
Down underneath Joel, we have... That's your cue,
that's
Maverick.
me. Yes, me, Maverick Christian. For some reason, I thought it was going to be Nick Peters next. Maverick Christian of Maverick Christian YouTube channel.
Well, speaking of Nick Peters, down here underneath me, we have...
Wade, right?
Right. Well, you know what? I can make it that way. So, yeah, no, we'll go with that.
You already said Nick Peters. Everybody knows who he is.
Yeah, yeah. Sufficient introductions here. So we may have some more people joining us a little later on. Hey, David Russell. Good to see you there. So we have at least a viewer tonight. So that's a win,
Hey,
right?
that's one more than normal.
Yeah, exactly. So tonight, hey, I'll take what I can get. So first compliment of the night. So
I take it
All
David
right.
Russell is a follower of yours.
I don't know about that. I think we just bounce
take it
back
with
and
text
forth.
in
We're
the mail
both
to
in
David
Virginia,
Russell,
so
Is he a Christianity attachment?
well, you remember we were over on their show on apostatize or proselytize.
Oh, but I wasn't there.
I got
had to
that
drop out of
backwards,
that
but oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, David Russell is partners with the open theistic presuppositionalist Calvinist David Parman, who doesn't affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm.
Oh, yeah, those guys.
Yeah.
I forget
Yeah,
what
see,
the acronym is, but
You've missed out on all the fun, Joe.
Yeah. Actually, come think of it, maybe it's because he wasn't here that we had all the fun.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a very good point. Speaking of fun, we've had enough of it for one night, though.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a rather deep topic tonight that's been all in the headlines this week. To give kind of a very brief summary for anybody who may be unfamiliar, there was a number of months back, there were some additional reports filed about Ravi Zacharias, and some additional information came down the pipe, and RZIM conducted a full investigation. They hired a
which
private
good for them,
firm.
by the way.
Right,
Yeah.
I agree. They hired an outside firm to do a investigation to look in on everything. And back, I think it was just before Christmas, they had gotten some preliminary information and said, hey, there's going to be some stuff here that's definitely not what we were kind of hoping for, and kind of let people brace for when the full report came out. And that hit this week, and it had some deeply disturbing information in that report. And so a lot of headlines. I think it made New York Times, Washington Post, all the major newspapers. It's a big story because Ravi was certainly one of the most well-known apologists that's lived in recent memory.
Yeah, he was an apologist that managed to make inroads to some of your more fundamentalist churches, which otherwise would tend to be, somewhat iffy on the idea of apologetics in general. Like, he was the apologist in many people's eyes who didn't know anybody else who did apologetics.
And when he died, his funeral was publicized. It was a very well-known event. I think even Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Mike Pence made statements about Ravi Zacharias, and you have that Babylon Bee story of Earth not deemed worthy of Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it was
he also made inroads into more of the secular community. He was,
Mhm.
he did interviews and debates on public radio, and I think he ended up on like History Channel or something, representing a Christian worldview for things. And he did a interview on the Ben Shapiro show and various things like that. So, in addition to being well recognized in the church, he was well recognized in the world. And I say that, more generally because he was probably one of the most well-traveled apologists, and he would represent the Christian worldview in, Islamic forums and Hindu forums. He was from India, so he was the obvious choice for that. But, he was one of the better-known apologists worldwide, and not just in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So his influence cannot be understated.
No, no, it really can't. Even among people I've spoke to who are completely out of the Christian loop, if you will, as far from it as they want to be, people still recognize Ravi's name because he was that kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I mean, there's no real easy way to kind of dive further into this. But let's talk a little bit for some people who may have not read the report yet. Let's talk about that briefly. Have you all had a chance to read it yet?
Yeah, I read it.
Not, but I've heard the worst of its contents.
I skimmed through it, and honestly, the night that I read it, I thought I'd have to take something for nausea before I went to bed because I thought I'd be sick reading that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is some pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. The report, too, I've even seen some people trying to dismiss it as some kind of hit piece, but there's really nothing here that's a conspiracy theory.
It would be very illogical for a hit piece to be written by the organization that holds his name after his death. Of all of the sources that could be trusted, it's the organization he started and that has his name on it.
Yeah, if this came out from someone like, say, Richard Carrier or something like that, yeah, I could understand being suspicious. But no, RZIM themselves published this. They're not going to do that unless there's some good evidence behind it.
It is pleasantly surprising and refreshing that the own organization was able to take a really good look at itself to find out what its leader had done wrong. I mean, you read the report, you're like, yeah, I don't think they held back on this one. They really did a sincere effort to get at the truth, and that's quite commendable. It's very.
And the UK branch of RZIM has even come out and said, we don't think they went far enough even, and we're disbanding from the American organization, and we're definitely going to change our name and do a total overhaul.
It's almost, when you read the report, it's almost hard to believe that there was anything even worse because it was really bad as it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, with how, as we already mentioned, RZIM did a good job with the unfettered kind of access that they gave the investigators here to really dig into things. And I think that's why the evidence is as convincing as it is because it was investigated from a lot of angles and a lot of independent sources.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on, we can welcome Steve into the stream. Steve, introduce yourself real quick.
Hello. I'm Steve.
Well,
good to be
all
here.
right.
He's obviously not used to being one of us and learning how to do our introductions.
No, I've been on a stream a few times before, so I won't bore everybody with the details. But if you feel like learning how to spell my last name, Schramm, you can go to steveschramm.com, and that's where you can find everything about me.
Wait, they don't know how to spell your last name.
Exactly.
So you direct them to a website using your last name so that they can learn how to spell your last name.
Didn't think this
Something
one
like
through
that.
entirely, did you?
We insist on logical, rational argumentation here, of course. So that's precisely why I gave it to you in that fashion. You can also go. I did make it easier for people. You can go to Enduring Together. EnduringTogether.com just redirects to my website. So if that's easier for you to remember, go there. Check
I
stuff
was
out.
thinking they could just go to steveyourlastname.com.
That would be amazing. I should buy that.
We have some concerns about where Maverick is streaming from, so
Okay.
if you can get us a special interview.
Oh, the reason for this lighting is so that because I'm going to have to go to bed eventually, and the blue light will make it the red light instead of the blue light will make it easier for me to go to sleep. That's the theory.
That's awesome.
I'll bow.
Oh,
On the next
look who's
Bill
so
Nye retired
fancy.
guy.
So, Steve, you've joined in. We just started talking about tonight's topic, which is, of course, Ravi Zacharias. We mentioned the report and started kind of discussing some of the elements contained therein. Is where we were getting to right when you arrived. So, feel free to jump
we
in
haven't actually
as we go.
mentioned any of the elements. We've just talked about how terrible they are.
That's true. Maybe we should mention a few of these things so people can get an idea of where we're talking. Who wants to stroll into this minefield?
I will.
I'll try and
I'm already in
handle it.
hell, apparently.
Yeah, I would
I'll
say
try and handle
that
it
Maverick
soon.
should be the one to.
Okay.
Nick, you're not an objective person in this particular discussion, so I think Maverick should probably be the one to do it.
So only one of the witnesses we interviewed, I'm reading directly from the report now, interviewed said that Mr. Zacharias engaged in sexual intercourse. This witness reported details of many encounters over a period of years she described as rape. And to protect her identity, this report does not disclose many of the details shared with us because a lot of them were willing to speak only on the condition of anonymity. So she reported that after he arranged for the ministry to provide her with financial support, he required sex of her. According to this witness, Mr. Zacharias used religious expressions to gain compliance. As she was raised to be a person of faith, she reported that he made her pray with him to thank God for the, quote, opportunity they both received. She said she called her his reward for living a life in the service of God, and he referenced the godly men in the Bible with more than one wife. She warned her not to ever speak out against him, or she would be responsible for the millions of souls whose salvation would be lost if his reputation was damaged. So that part I can understand making a lot of people nervous. That was incredibly manipulative
Mm-hmm.
on top of everything else.
And egotistical.
I
Yeah,
had assumed that there would be some written manipulation in there, but I didn't think the report would actually contain the details. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was like, wow, that's pretty evil.
Yeah, both a misuse of his ministry, his position, and even the blatant abuse of religious beliefs. That's definitely what caught me most off guard about this whole thing.
And RZIM
I would like to
says
speak to that eventually, but I won't jump in until we conclude.
RZIM also said that their mistake was they trusted Ravi too much because he had phones that weren't authorized by RZIM, email accounts that weren't authorized by RZIM, and he would regularly travel to Bangkok to visit family when that really wasn't what was going on. I mean, they found him with several nude photos and things of that sort.
Some of them on the members of the organization were a little bit suspicious. So regarding the matter of Ms. Thompson, they mentioned that she was shifting details as emails and other relevant factors were publicly leaked and was forced to explain them. Rather than fostering an environment of truth-seeking transparency, Mr. Zacharias was strident and inflammatory. He described his critics as nasty people, lunatics for engaging in satanic-type slander and falsehood. Some of the RZIM staff told him that they expressed frustration without having issued an apology at all. At an all-staff meeting in January 2018, after significant details of the Thompson communications had been made public, Mr. Zacharias offered explanations that many of the staff members found nonsensical. But some staff members reported to us, I'm reading from the report again, that when they expressed doubts about Mr. Zacharias' story, they were ignored, marginalized, and accused of disloyalty.
And the Miss Thompson, as mentioned in the report, was actually an incident from a number of years ago. I think it was back in 2016, if I recall correctly, where there were some allegations made about some back and forth on the phone that she shared with Mr. Zacharias, and how it became inappropriate and manipulative as well, with him even threatening suicide if she revealed any of the details of their conversation. And it eventually ended in an NDA to essentially stop them from speaking on anything, and a settlement was paid in that case, and that was a number of years ago. And it certainly raised some questions at the time, but it doesn't sound like they were adequately kind of investigated at that time anyway.
Yeah, this investigation law firm couldn't investigate further into the details because of that NDA.
Yeah, and nobody would offer to release them from it.
Yeah, it's probably not coincidental that all of this is coming to light after his death.
Yeah, and Clinton, welcome.
Yeah, I do remember a lot of women were, at least one of the men were mentioning, is like they didn't want to speak out because of the fear that they would not be believed. And that is in practice why a lot of women don't speak out, because a lot of them know they'll be retaliated against, and it's sometimes just not pretty.
And I think you've certainly seen that here, especially towards Miss Thompson a number of years ago, and even after this full report, I've still seen some people responding with such disbelief. Even in the face of evidence and the collaborating reports we're seeing here, there's still this sense of disbelief. And, Miss Thompson faced probably some of the worst of it at the time, because, it was so downplayed by Ravi, as well as by everyone kind of surrounding it at that time, that it couldn't have been easy for her to bring her story forward, but she did.
It's amazing there is disbelief now, because at this point, the evidence is very overwhelming. I mean, like what was mentioned earlier, this report comes straight from RZIM itself.
Yeah.
Well, it is not unknown for people to not want to believe something so devastating to their beliefs.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
And Clinton, thanks for joining us.
You are welcome. We got a bit of a full house tonight.
We do. So we have just dived into things here and are getting to discuss some of this. Have you had a chance to read the report?
I have not read the report. I did read RZIM's statement. So full disclosure, I haven't had a chance to read through the report yet, but what I've heard from other apologists has been pretty damning. And that it's not just the accusations, but they have very good evidence to corroborate the accusations and everything. So it's pretty much beyond reasonable doubt now that Ravi Zacharias, sexually and spiritually abused a number of women while he was doing ministry, while he was around.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but the term predator definitely applies.
Yeah, predatory behavior,
I think that's
grooming,
right.
that kind of thing.
Now, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, no, I was just thinking, I don't know what the direction, of the conversation, really should be. To say that this is a tough topic is like, well, that's such an understatement. It's ridiculous. I mean, I don't know, like of the apologists in the world that I was introduced to, I would say Ravi was number 3. And so, I mean, I can speak probably for all of us that hours and hours of time has been spent with his content. So to think anything like this is just absolutely horrific. I know. So again, the point I'm getting at is I don't know to what degree we want to discuss exactly what happened. I'm sure we do. I was actually just reading another letter by an RZIM staffer earlier today that's even more troubling than any of the reports I've read so far. So that might be something to talk about. But I wanted to make it known that as being somebody who is publicly in ministry, as you all are as well, I think one of the most important things is kind of to assess and discuss how on earth do we deal with this? What are some practical things that we can learn and do? And I've got some things that I am considering for the future. I've got some steps that I've already taken. So at whatever point that we want to discuss that, I think that's going to be a really huge part of this. At least I think it should be.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And, if I can just jump in real quick, yeah. So I guess full disclosure also, I am not very familiar at all with Ravi Zacharias. I am not someone who followed his ministry. I was aware of him, and once in a while he'd say something that I thought was pretty good. But there were already some accusations going around about how he was dishonest about his credentials and things like that. That kind of raised some red flags with me. Not to say that I'm like any more like spiritually in tune than the rest of you. I'm not trying to make myself out to be any better spiritually or anything like that, just by myself not being taken in by Rabbi. So I just wanted to let anyone who might be listening know that he was actually not someone that I followed, even though I was familiar with him, and I know a number of people who were impressed by his work and followed him pretty closely. So as far as me, I don't have any sort of, I'm not going through any difficulty right now because of this, but I do know some people who are. And so obviously I feel for those people, and I know that they're having some difficulties right now because, you just don't want to, it's a hard thing. It's like they say, never meet your heroes. It's a hard thing knowing that someone whose ministry you followed for years turned out to be, no real nice way to say this, but turned out to be a scumbag.
Well, if I can speak at that point, because I've said before that I'm probably one who knows the most about Ravi on a personal level of all of us. And for me, my journey started because I consider A Case for Christ the book that lit my fire with Christian apologetics. And shortly after that was Case for Faith. And Ravi was the 5th chapter on that one. Isn't it wrong to say Jesus is the only way to God? And I found his chapter amazing. And I started listening to his radio show and reading his books. And I really liked the way he spoke, the way he fought. And sometime shortly after that, when Christmas came up here and said, "What would you like for Christmas?" And I honestly said, "I'd like to get to meet Ravi Zacharias sometime." And so the April after that, I got to go down to Atlanta and go to RZIM and got invited to go straight into Ravi's office and talk with him. For a while, he gave me several CDs, a video cassette thing. Yeah, that shows you how long ago this was, of Jesus Among Other Gods. And I'd talk to him every now and then. Sometimes he actually gave Allie and I a little gift for our wedding. And the last time I saw him was shortly after Jesus Among Secular Gods came out. And I had grown a beard then for Allie, which I've shaved since then. But I went up to him and I started talking in the book signing line, and I had the beard, so I guess he didn't recognize me. And finally he looks and says, "Nick, is that you?" And I introduced him to Allie. And so when this happened, like so many others, it's kind of like a punch in the gut at that point. And I think one thing to say about all this that concerns me is I've seen so many atheists sharing this story and using it as a weapon against us. In some ways, I understand it, but I think we should make it clear there are no winners really, in this situation. And I think I would hope some atheists out there realizing that, yes, Ravi was a predator, but that doesn't show Christianity is false. And if anything, we need to be thinking more about the victims right now, instead of using their suffering as a tool, as a weapon to go against our foes. These are. There's a story where Ravi talks about a neighbor of his who was raped by a man with a gun who threatened to kill her child, and how he says, I understand a person in this case never ceases to be a victim, and how she described herself as being violated. And now I look back and I think, yeah, and now it turns out you were doing quite a bit of violating yourself, apparently. You really don't know what to think about what he said anymore.
Yeah, and if we have any younger viewers, when Nick talks about a cassette tape, he's talking about one of these bad boys right here.
Actually, a video cassette tape.
Oh, video cassette tape. Oh, okay. I don't have one of those handy, but
it went in this antique thing called a VCR back then.
Yeah, I do still have some old video cassettes, but they're at my new place because I'm moving in about a month. So, yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing that story, Nick, and I want to come back to that here in just a second. Steve, you had mentioned this additional report. I don't know if anybody else has read that, but you said it had some disturbing information as well. Would you share just a little bit about that while we're talking about evidence?
This extra report?
Yeah,
who did it?
Well, it's not a report. So what it is, and again, I literally just found it like an hour ago. All right, so I'm not gonna judge its validity or whatever. But so this is a letter. Ironically, the header of the letter is confidential, but it's on a publicly accessible Google Drive that anybody can get. It's a letter from former RZIM spokesperson Ruth Malhotra. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but she was basically their official spokesperson. And this is a letter written on February 6th to the chairman of the board, and it is 28. It's 28 pages long, just paragraphs of text, and essentially it's this letter written from Ruth to the chairman of the board detailing, her experience and of the different things you can imagine as the person who is, literally she was hired on as a PR person. She was doing PR for RZIM, from what I understand, from 2013 until just recently, I guess. And so there are essentially details here that have to do more with her personal experience. So certainly this is, I would say, doesn't carry the same, objective weight as something like the third party report done by Miller and Martin, et cetera. But certainly this is eyewitness testimony. And so it deserves to be, considered. And it's pretty, there's no new allegations necessarily, so to speak, from this. It's just more so, like, for example, one of the headers here is attempt to discredit victims. So here you have some personal information, detailing interactions between Sarah Davis and Abdu Murray and Michael Ramsden, and you actually have some of the back and forth that was going on, from the PR angle of trying to deal with this. I think what the point of this letter is to explicate, or to explicate her awareness of the level to which the RZIM board also shares, including herself. She's including herself in this. She's with remorse and prayerfulness, the whole nine yards. The idea is we need to all be figuring out to what degree, to what level of complicity do we have in this? What level of responsibility do we bear for this? And here are the different things. And so it's essentially a walkthrough of some of the different events and the key points, different things that they have gone through. Like, one of the headers is resistance to investigation. Brian Kelly, his attorney, approach to legal action. And so like, for example, this first paragraph says, throughout the litigation, attorney Brian Kelly demonstrated a bombastic approach, replete with aggressive assertions and language inappropriate to represent anyone, minister of the gospel. How this conduct was acceptable and even applauded by Rob was, and like this in 2017, in the early stages of his RICO, I'm not sure what that means. I didn't read above that, but against the Thompsons. So I guess that has to do with the litigation against the Thompsons in that initial case. It says, and this is just heartbreaking if any of it's true, but it says Ravi would often invoke Kelly, his attorney, making statements such as, my attorney said we are going to crush them. When discussing the monetary settlement, Kelly said, if they come out with the money, I will sue them into oblivion. There was one, I mean, there was one instance where I didn't read this in this report, but I read it in a tweet that was between her and Daniel Gilman, a former RZIM staffer, talking about how, I think this says this in a report somewhere, but I just didn't read it that closely. Something about them, taking bets on how long the Thompsons' marriage was going to last. I mean, just stuff that just, like, I would have never, it almost sounds like, no, there's no way this happened. But then the other stuff is just as unbelievable to me as well, to think that he could have been a sexual and, spiritual predator. I mean, that's just, mind-boggling anyway. So I do think this is something that is worth a read. It's, again, eyewitness testimony. And if what she says in here is true, then absolutely, RZIM needs, and the UK branch broke off from them, essentially saying that they don't think the steps that the U.S. organization is taking is going far enough. And a broader reform needs to take place, including potentially even changing the name of the entire organization, or either disbanding the entire organization and everyone going their own separate ways. So,
yeah, when I read the report, I thought the same thing. It's like, are they going to keep their name now? I mean, what's in their report is pretty bad. Yeah.
I mean, I don't see how they could. And to be frank, we'll get more to this later, but this is one of those things, I think, where, like, I'm even considering, like, because right now a lot of my ministry stuff is my name, and obviously I don't plan to ever hurt my family or anybody in the way that this, obviously nobody, I don't think, plans for that, but, like, there are definite consequences to having your name in front of a ministry that go far beyond just this stuff. And so that's something that I'm really thinking, like, do I just need to totally rebrand? I've already started 3/4 of the way down the Bible nerd thing anyway. Why don't I just take it all the way home, and I'm, who knows, I might do something like that, just because this is really eye-opening and startling.
Yeah. I guess I can make a little bit of an appeal here, because I think it's unwise to use your own name for ministry for a few reasons. I mean, number one, there's the situation of
go down my list of items I wanted to talk about.
Hold on just a second. Let's let Clinton finish his thought.
Yeah.
And then we'll get back to you on that, Joe.
Okay, so number one is like the Ravi Zacharias thing. If a scandal happens, everyone else in your ministry.
There's a bit of delay because I didn't hear Clinton start talking.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so if there's a scandal like with Ravi Zacharias, everyone else affiliated with your ministry is going to be in trouble, and especially moving forward after all that goes down. But number two, if it's a Christian ministry, you want the focus to be on Christ, not to be on the individual. And number three, just by having your name affiliated with your ministry, people aren't going to know what your ministry is about. It seems like you would want to have a name that just by hearing the name of your organization or your ministry, people will know what the focus of your ministry is, if it's apologetics or whatever the case may be. So I think there are at least a few good reasons why you should go with a more with a name more specific to your ministry rather than going with your specific name.
And before Joe says something, it's also pointed out that HarperCollins has apparently come out and said that they're going to pull Ravi Zacharias' books from publishing and selling, and that Lee Strobel is going to do another version of Case for Faith with Ravi's material edited out of it.
Yeah, and I would love to hit on later the implications of that.
Yeah, we'll definitely revisit that. Joel, wanted to give you a chance here. I know you got a bit of a delay, But I want to let you kind of dive in here. It looks like you had somewhere you wanted to take this.
Well, I mean, the thing that reminds me of what we're talking about the most is that it seems like Zacharias's elocution, if you will, petered out around the end of the 90s. Because I used to follow his podcast and it just got repetitive. He had about 5 talks that he gave, and it was just a constant repetition of those 5 talks in cycle. And the 5 talks that he gave were about what I heard when I heard him speak in the 90s. So I don't know when he began this behavior, but it may very well have injured his ministry and his capacity to speak for God, because I've noticed also that the later books that he wrote, his contributions weren't particularly profound to them.
Yeah, and I haven't read the whole thing, so I won't speak on it too much. But his most recently released book, just before he died, was significantly different in that it didn't consist of a lot of content, if you will. It was very short, kind of a devotional-esque in some ways, but the parts that I read were even a little bit toned down from even what you would see in a devotional in some ways. So I found it, even at the time, I found it a little off and weird. It didn't seem in character with some other things I had read. And again, I haven't read the whole thing, so but what I did, just it seemed off to me a little bit.
Yeah, I think that kind of comes along with the fact that Zacharias would actually lie about and exaggerate his credentials, because from what I heard and what I read from Ravi Zacharias, it was never very deep. Like he had some good responses to atheists that you could find on YouTube, but just about everything, nothing he taught on was novel in any way. And everything he taught on, you could find better and more sophisticated defenses of it. And so I think in many ways, Ravi Zacharias was primarily popular for being popular. He had a platform where millions of people loved him, and I think that's what I think. Even in Christianity, we have a tendency to lift up celebrities and put them on pedestals. And someone who has a large following like Zacharias, there can be that idea of, God wouldn't bless him with such a huge ministry if any of these accusations that have come out were true. So that can be another reason why you might think that whatever's come out about Ravi Zacharias might not be true. So I think there's definitely that, and that's kind of another reason why I was never really taken much with Ravi Zacharias, because I prefer to. Because especially being that I specialize in bioethics, I prefer to go to, the ones, I do read some of the popularizers, but if I'm going to be engaging with atheists, especially since I engage with academic literature, I need to, keep up with the more academic material. And Ravi Zacharias was just more of a popularizer than he was a scholar. He wasn't a scholar at all. He was just a popularizer of Christian arguments. So, I think there's probably a bit of that going on with Ravi Zacharias too.
At the risk of being self-congratulatory, that was the entire philosophy behind the foundation of the Mentionables, was that it was a non-celebrity apologetics organization. We grabbed the unknowns and we got their voices out there, and we did so as a group so as not to allow one to rise above the others.
But with Watkins, I think something to keep in mind that we're all still relatively unknowns, and a lot of people are listening to our podcast might be in the apologetics arena and could be mentionables themselves someday, and are still unknowns. And that's all I remember. Ravi was there one time too, before the age of the internet. And this should be a reminder to every Christian apologist out there to watch yourself closely, to do everything you can, especially because sexual sin can be the most damaging sin to fall into publicly. And I mean, I don't think Ravi started out wanting to go down this route. And we don't know, but my guess is it probably started out with something small and innocent. And then it just snowballed into something bigger. And that should be a warning to all of us, because any one of us could go down that path.
So, if I may be permitted to tell a personal story here, out of college, I worked in a group home for abused children. And these children would come in and they have certain behavior patterns that they had developed in the course of their abuse. And so one of these was manipulation. And they were very skilled at finding personal buttons, weak spots, and so forth, and then pushing those. And I found, they come from these backgrounds where you think the people that treated them this way were scumbags, and they were. But then, having this kid sit here and manipulate me and push my buttons constantly, at one point I found myself internally, wow, I want to hit this kid. And that thought just stunned me. And it was at that moment that I realized I was no better than these people who, the environment that they came out of, and that I had that evil inside of myself, that capacity to be as bad as these other people. The thing about power, as we all know, is that it corrupts. And among the reasons that it corrupts is it gives you access to things that you don't have access to when you don't have that power. And we all have within us the capacity to sin, and sin very badly. And the more avenues to express that sin that open up to us, the more possibly those sins are expressed through us. And so, yes, it's a cautionary tale that perhaps none of us should rise to a level of power where those opportunities are available to us. And this is a man who also put his name on his organization, which speaks to the level of power that he rose to. And you can see some of this egotism and manipulation of his power arising within this report. So, yeah, it's a danger, and it's a danger that we cannot sit here and judge a person without recognizing that this is a capacity we all have within us, but for the grace of God.
Yeah, I think one of the tough things too is, as like a role model, I don't know about anybody else, but I am, I'm very business minded. I love everything I do. I try to do it in a very structured way. And so it's very easy as somebody like that to get jealous of the enterprise that is something like RZIM. I'm not, not going to lie, especially in early days when I was first getting into this, public ministry stuff, I was like, man, it would be super cool to one day, have a ministry that was making that kind of impact. And while it's still likely true that RZIM as a whole was having a giant amount of impact overall, it by no means would I ever want to have all of that influence and have to bear that weight that obviously he did, and obviously to be in the position that he was. I don't think any of us would consciously, knowing that, make that trade. And so it really even provides another perspective around the whole enterprise of, well, how large, how much impact is too much impact almost. It's hard to know. It's hard to judge that. Not that there's too much impact for Christ, but when are you putting yourself in a position where you are more vulnerable to violate the very principles on which you founded that organization and that enterprise?
One of the unique aspects of the corruption of power that you see within Christianity versus, say, politics or business, you can see these Hollywood directors that turns out they were doing a casting couch type thing, and they get dragged out into the light and then they go their way, and it doesn't necessarily besmirch the industry from which they came. The unique thing about religion and Christianity specifically is that there is this moral base, this idea that, above all things, we have this standard of morality or ethics that is grounded within absolute reality in the nature of God. And because of this moral aspect to Christianity, the types of sin in which he engaged and in which, others as well, and I'd like to speak to that a bit in the future, there is this sort of protective hedge that's built about them, because if it were to be shown that they're in violation of these standards held by this field, by Christianity in general, then this would be a damage to the name of Christianity. And this becomes a protective measure, because the body, the religious organization out of which they come, and the individuals they're abusing, feel an obligation to the principles above the person. And it is this obligation to the principles that gives the person this latitude to misbehave in these ways.
I think there's two issues we majorly need to make sure we address here as well. First off, what do we say about atheists who use this as a weapon against Christianity and as a demonstration of a failure of Christianity? And second, what do we say to the victims of Ravi out there? I think we have to hit on those two issues.
Well, I suppose you can remind them of the old ad hominem fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that intellectualism really hits the spot on an issue like this. When it comes to
atheists are going to use this as a weapon against Christianity, that say, well, this, even though some terrible, we could also remind them of the Bible verse Jesus prophesied about, where he says, not everyone who calls me Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven. And there'll be evildoers who claim to perform even miracles in my name that won't enter the kingdom of heaven. And we can point to that Jesus prophesied that men like this would occur. They would enter into our world. They would, get a claim and all that. And so this is really to be expected. This sort of thing happening is unfortunately to be expected if Christianity is true.
There's
so
also the old saying that hypocrisy is a compliment that vice pays to virtue.
Yeah, in terms of hypocrisy, none of us were directly violated by him or abused by him, but maybe secondarily in terms of, if you looked up to him or put stock in what he said, there is this, broad tertiary victimization in that respect. But one of the reasons that none of us are sitting around here questioning our beliefs because of what he did is because we recognize that in the case of hypocrisy, there are two things involved. There's a person and there's a principle. Now, when this kind of thing occurs, we fault the person, not the principle. The principle's solid. We know that people have autonomy. We know that sex should be occurred within the context of marriage with consent of both parties, and that, it should never be victimizing in any way or egregious, or, all of these things we recognize. We recognize the principles are solid, and we recognize that it is the man, not the principles, which are at fault. And so, that being the case, this is not a thing that impacts the internal nature of Christianity as much as it impacts the external. And by that, I mean that this is a thing which we've mentioned, that an atheist could look at Christianity and say, aha, here's a guy that did a thing and he was a Christian. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that this bears more latitude on them, that they don't recognize the person versus principle dichotomy here, is because in their mind, religion is a thing which proposes to keep the people within it moral and does not keep the people within it moral. And one could even say, from their perspective, they would argue that religion facilitates immorality. So in this case, you could look at the kinds of things he was saying to the victims and using to manipulate them. And these were religious things that he was giving religious reasons to manipulate them. And in this respect, religion facilitated the evil that was done. And so, this is the conflict that we have within internally to Christianity. Most people are going to recognize that it's the man, not the system, at fault. Externally, they're going to say, aha, this system does not keep its members from being immoral, and in fact facilitates that immorality.
Augustine had a saying that you never judge a philosophy by its misuse.
And
If anything, we can say that what was going on was not because Ravi was following the teachings of Christ, it was because he was not following them. And I think we could make this a distinction between something like, say, Islam, where you see the leader of the founder itself engaging in this kind of behavior, and then that's what happens later on down the road. But with Christianity, the reason this is such a scandal is because even an atheist can tell you're supposed to have the opposite take place with Christianity.
so the Bible verse that I was trying to recollect was Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 through 23. And Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on the day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." And when I saw the reports of Ravi Zacharias about how he says this is my gift for God giving a ministry and so forth, what I talked about earlier, it kind of made me wonder, is like, did he drink his own Kool-Aid on this matter? Is he the sort of people that Jesus prophesied about in Matthew chapter 27? Matthew chapter 7.
My guess is that those were things he was telling himself in addition to the victim, because I'm sure at some point he still considered himself a minister and a Christian and recognized that this behavior is not the kind of thing that a minister and a Christian ought to be doing. And so he was giving justifications unto himself in addition to the victims. So I, like you're saying, drinking his own Kool-Aid, I'm guessing to a degree he was. I imagine he went to sleep at night, prayed to God, and thought to himself, isn't the Lord blessing me with this kind of thing?
There's a quote from the physicist Richard Feynman where he says, the first rule is do not be fooled. And remember, you are the easiest person to fool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I'll tell you what's really like, being the kind of people we are, nerdy about the Bible and really into being careful about scripture and defending the Bible. This is obviously, it's kind of one of those things where, if you look at things in light of eternality and his responsibility to preach the gospel, it arguably is even a bigger issue than the actual predatory behavior. But it's kind of hard to say anything is more of an event when you're violating another human being. But what he was using was distort scripture, just of the gospel, not being careful about not only not being careful about what he was saying, but actually you have to believe almost intentionally misusing these things, like about having more than one wife and things of that nature in order to get the people to not be quiet and to say that you'll be hurting. It was he who was at very moment hurting the ministry in multiple ways. In tons of books spoken, probably ever will, about the gospel, being a person who was supposed to be able to interpret scripture well and expound scripture well and share good ideas about it. And it turns out that he was misusing it for his own good, or not good, but his own gain. And so that's troubling from the standpoint of, being, doing what we apologists and being, Bible interpreters.
Now, before we move on from that, I think that's a good point. And maybe one thing we could just briefly focus on is the kind of safeguards that should be in place in somebody's life to prevent this kind of thing. Because the matter of fact is that we all have some degree of power. You know, every single person out there has some power over somebody. So the abuse of it is something that can occur too easily. And in a situation where somebody has this much power, it was clearly misused in many, many ways. So any thoughts on kind of safeguards that should be in place in a Christian's life to prevent this kind of thing, or to at least try and head it off before it occurs?
One of the first
I
things
think we should also definitely have something to say to the victims before we close out. But
absolutely.
I even went some friends of mine and said, guys, honestly, if you ever get for him, but you think I'm engaging in any sexual impropriety, I want you to call me out on it immediately. I want you to be able to feel free to get in my face and say something about it. And for my part, unless I'm related to a woman, I don't ride in a car along with a woman. I don't have a meal alone with her. I won't even get in an elevator alone with another woman, because even if you're not doing anything, you can't risk things happening today, especially in the age of Me Too.
Well, the thing about a sexual impropriety is that it happens behind closed doors. So it's probably not going to be a thing that a person's going to witness to call someone out on. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about in general. That's probably not going to be a blanket principle that helps keep people away from this sort of thing. Keeping yourself accountable would obviously be a way to go. But if you are in a position where you're not going to keep yourself accountable, that's no guarantee.
One thing that really comes to mind quickly when I'm reading from Matthew chapter 7 is one of the virtues to constantly practice is self-honesty. Like the first step to recognize that you have problems, and it's just dealing with sin is recognizing that you have this. We all kind of have this a little bit of addiction to one degree or other to sin, to transgression. And the first thing to do is be honest with yourself. We are still sinners. We can still horribly screw up things. That when you do sin, don't rationalize it. Don't deceive yourself. Be honest with yourself and to God.
Yeah. One thing that's always very much on my mind is it is the fact that, I could very well fall into this kind of sin myself because, I'm single. I've spent most of my life single. I have no prospects at all for marriage. And so it's very much on my mind that, in the wrong situation, I could very well be someone who falls into temptation. Now, I don't believe I would be like Ravi Zacharias and try to hide it. I do believe I would be open and honest about it, because I try to be as open and honest about my personal life as possible, so that even if I do fall into a sin, I want to make sure the relevant people know about it. I repent, I apologize, those kinds of things. So one of the most important things is just number one is you have to work on your own self-discipline, self-control. Scripture speaks about this often. I also hold a natural law, and natural law is big on establishing virtues and avoiding vices and making these things habits. So one of the biggest things is in your own personal life is establish self-control. I believe I'm not going to ever take sexual advantage of a woman because I have that self-control. And even if I find myself attracted to someone, I'm not going to try anything because I've fostered that sense of self-control. Now, that doesn't mean that that's a guarantee by any means. I mean, obviously there are, I'm not perfect. I'm not superhuman. I have sins that, in fact, I have sins that I struggle with often. Like I struggle with my weight, and so that kind of thing it's actually a lifelong struggle with me. So I don't. So I'm not trying to make myself come off as any sort of like superhuman Christian, non-sinner or something. But just in terms of how we avoid these kinds of things is, number one, establish your sense of self-control, so that even if you find yourself in these situations, you can because like Scripture says, God will provide a way out if you find yourself in these temptations. But number two, another way is just to avoid compromising situations. Because I think of someone like Chuck Colson, who, if any of our listeners are unfamiliar, he was one of the folks involved in the Watergate scandal with Richard Nixon. He ends up coming to Christ in prison, and once he's released from prison, he forms a ministry, forms an organization. But the change in his life is drastic and it's real, and so he's a legitimate Christian. But there are still people, even if he wasn't going to be sinning publicly like that, or privately, there were still people who are trying to ruin his ministry by like sending a prostitute up to his hotel room or something like that to try to get him in some compromising situation. So another way that we can avoid these things, because even if you don't sin, there can still be the appearance of sin, which can ruin your ministry if someone thinks you've been doing these things when you haven't. So avoid these compromising situations. Like I was, I've actually always been taught back when I was teaching children in my church. The Baptist church that I attended for most of my early life, I ended up teaching kids. And, one of the things they told me is, always make sure there's somebody in there with you so that, if there's ever anyone who tries to bring an accusation against you, you have that other person who can vouch for you. And like Nick was saying, avoid any situation which might be considered romantic, especially if you're meeting with a woman who's married. You always want to avoid these kinds of situations. So there are ways in which you can keep yourself from these, but also like we often told in church too is maybe find like an accountability partner, someone who can keep you accountable and you can tell your struggles and temptations with, things like that. So there are a number of things which you can do to avoid these situations, and not just stumbling in these situations, but even avoiding any appearance that you're doing anything improprietous.
Yeah, accountability, confessing your thought sins, if you will, to somebody prior to them becoming action sins, it's the approach that I am drawn to. If I feel as if I'm thinking something I ought not to be thinking, I typically try to find a brother in Christ and ask him if I can speak with him about these things. And so, it's a way of keeping yourself accountable. Again, this assumes that you're the type of person who wants to keep yourself accountable, who wants to avoid this kind of thing. And I'm hoping that everybody here is that person. But, there is also the reverse where how do we keep this kind of person from taking advantage of a ministry, from getting into a position of authority and then destroying the ministry around them by doing the thing the ministry is against.
That's true. That's a difficult one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the report sort of addresses this. Did anyone get to that part?
I have not read the report.
I read over it, but I'm not sure which part you're talking about here.
Okay, so I'll read part of it here. This is on the Thompson matter. Because Dr. Zacharias was able to convince the members of the RZIM board and management that he was the victim of extortionists, RZIM did not investigate the allegations. A full investigation might have uncovered evidence of misconduct at a time when Mr. Zacharias was still alive to explain himself. So I think that lack of willingness to take a good hard look at your own organization, having the attitude of seeking truth above all else. I mean, they eventually did so because they hired a third party to do this kind of report, which was clearly insincere. But if they only had that effort when he was alive, I mean, I can understand how it would be harder to do an investigation, to be willing to look at it while the person you want to investigate, the leader, is still there.
How did the board for RZIM work? Like, if someone had come forward with that accusation and they thought that it might have been credible, or they thought they should have at least investigated it, could someone on the board have essentially benched Ravi Zacharias until they investigated, or did he not give the board that kind of power?
From what I read in the report, it feels like he had significant amount of power, even over the board, to the extent that if he pushed hard enough, things wouldn't be looked into. That was the impression I got. And of course, that could be people wanting to look the other way in that this is not true, rather than pursuing truth at all cost here. which is bothersome. And I'm sure everybody there will probably be looking back, doubting the decisions they made because of this, because that certainly is an organizational issue.
It looks like theoretically they, judging from just the impression I'm giving the report, because he says he was able to convince the members of the RZIM board and management that he was not the victim, therefore RZIM did not investigate the allegations. It kind of sounds like they could have had the power to investigate the allegations if they really wanted to.
Yeah. And sadly, that's something we're going to go with a lot of unanswered questions now as to what was truly on his heart in some of these things, because it wasn't investigated. In some ways, it's a lot more difficult than had it been investigated at the time. And even if all this came out then, at least he would have had a chance to speak to it some, rather than leaving some of these things completely unanswered.
So I'm going to have to go soon. I'd like to raise one last point.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Prior to leaving. And I don't like to be the guy who always drags my research back into things, but I'm going to drag my research back into things. I'm going to start by reading. I published my findings on a publication that I write for called Hub Pages. And the first comment that I got after publishing, this is my full report after doing the research, was from a reader that said, "You seem to have left out some of the most common reasons, such as a child becoming an atheist because a, quote, Christian adult they are taught to trust, such as a youth pastor, molests them and their friends repeatedly, forcing the child to realize hypocrisy of religion and so-called followers. But hey, I guess that's not an easy pill to swallow. We'll blame it on more minute factors." All right. So after a conversation with this person, it turns out that her husband is the person that she's referring to who became an atheist because of a situation like that. I have not yet heard a direct testimony or from a person who became an atheist because of this kind of thing, but I do hear it talked about quite a bit in the atheist community, quite a bit. Some of the people that I've listened to talk are counselors that deal specifically with people who came out of religion and the religious abuse that they received. Now, religious abuse might be an exaggeration of their memory, looking back at all the things that happened to them while they were a Christian and, from their perspective as an atheist thinking, well, these things weren't right. But it also includes this kind of activity perpetrated by Christian leaders. And we've seen enough Christian leaders having been exposed for this kind of thing to know that it's not unheard of. Christianity, in the church, we give certain people the kinds of power that can be used to do this kind of thing. Youth leaders are a good example. I personally know a person who was working in a church. He was given a position of some authority within the church, and he was working with a youth ministry, teenagers. And it turns out he was a pedophile, and he abused some of these teenagers and did so under the auspices of the church. He was eventually exposed when some of the teens reported him, and he went to prison for his activities. But he was put in a position where he had the ability to do that. And it is a thing that happens in churches. Churches attract the kind of person who can do this sort of behavior because they create an environment that facilitates the kind of behavior, especially if you're a predator who is familiar with grooming your victims. Grooming refers to a behavior wherein the predator will set up the situation in advance. The predator will take time to get to know the person, to establish a relationship, to establish trust, to create a pattern within the relationship where he is meeting this person alone at periods of time. And this can go on for weeks, possibly years, to get the person to a position where they are victimizable. And part of that building, part of what the predator builds is a back door which allows them to do the thing without being reported. And this is something they set up ahead of time. When it's with a child, they will typically kind of build in this idea that the child's the one who's in the wrong, that they're going to get in trouble. And I imagine this is the kind of thing that, you heard what he was saying to the woman, that if she reported him, she'd be responsible for X, Y, and Z. And so he built into this a situation wherein he was protecting himself from the back door to make sure that he would not get in trouble for the behavior. And so the church environment is an environment that can be taken advantage of by predators. And it can be taken advantage of people who come into the environment specifically because it gives them that opportunity. And so the thing that really needs to be thought about on the whole, in the grand scheme of things, is how do we structure ministries and church environments to weed out these kinds of individuals and to eliminate the possibility of them grooming individuals within the church and setting up situations in the process of grooming where they can then take advantage of these people. Because predators are out there. It's not always a person who's in the ministry and gradually becomes a predator. Sometimes it's a person who enters the environment because they are a predator. So yes, ministry gives people the opportunity to do these things, and eventually they might gravitate towards that kind of behavior because they can. But on the other hand, possibly they come into the environment because the environment facilitates the type of behavior they're already involved in. And all of this, of course, I'm learning from deconversion research, but whether or not the victims deconvert over this needs to stop happening.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I know certainly in some of the churches I've been in the past, there's such a credibility given to anyone who has a legitimate testimony, if you will. You're given such a degree of trust as being a Christian that the same safeguards and background checks, the kind of things that we would expect within even a job environment to avoid this sort of thing, are overlooked in some of these scenarios. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, in the case of Ravi, he sort of made a saint of himself. He was sort of given sainthood in the church prior to death, to the degree that, here is a person you look up to as an example and a paradigm, and he can do no wrong, we assume.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I don't know exactly how this relates to the discussion currently going on. Sorry to jump in on that here, but I know before I cut out a minute ago, Clinton was talking about accountability, and it seemed to me like that was still somewhat part of the discussion that Joel was mentioning there. How do we aid this in the future? Certainly accountability of some sort. One of the things about the power that Ravi did yield being in this situation. So in the report from Ruth, the former RZIM spokesperson, she detailed one of the elements being that the entire essentially legacy of the Zacharias family was apparently a very big deal within RZIM. The idea was, don't do anything that crosses the family. The family is to be held in high regard. The name is to be held in high regard. That sort of idea. And she talks about one of these instances. Y'all are, I'm sure, familiar with Michael Ramsden. He was one of the highest ranking officials in RZIM. And apparently there was some concern about Ravi. So I'll just read this quote. This is directly from her. She says, Michael Ramsden told me on multiple occasions that the Zacharias family was so concerned that Ravi traveled on the road with a woman who provided private massage services to him that they asked him to intervene. However, Michael told me that when he confronted Ravi about this, Ravi refused to talk to Michael for the next 2 years. It was evident that Michael didn't ever want to cross Ravi, and so anything that might cause him to get in trouble with Ravi, he avoided. This was an unhealthy dynamic, of course, and the failure to challenge Ravi turned out to be catastrophic. So that's the kind of power that you see. And so the question is, how do you possibly avoid someone, being in a position of that sort of power to wield over other people?
This is an attempt to excuse him, but I'm genuinely curious if anything about his cultural background was involved in this kind of behavior. What is the patriarchy of the Indian society like, that might or might not contribute to this sort of thing?
I don't know about all that. I think it's important to discuss, but I probably should go at 11 also. And I was hoping to have something to say to the victims.
Yeah,
Yes.
might as well do that now
And
before you go.
one thing I keep thinking is that, no one ever deserves to be a victim. We should all agree that everything that happened to these women who did things unwillingly or under duress or anything like that is horrible and evil, and there is no justification whatsoever for it. That being said, I think RZIM should definitely look into restitution of whatever kind it takes to the people who have been victimized by Ravi. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. I'd say that anyone out there who has been victimized, I know it's not as easy as saying things, but what happened did happen in the past. But always what you do with your future is up to you. And if you want to rise above this, it's not necessarily going to be easy, but it is possible. And you can overcome. And you can still live a life you can be proud of and enjoy. And there is hope. And I would really beg you to please realize it wasn't Jesus Christ who abused you. It was a sick man who definitely had his own issues to deal with. But the Christ he was supposed to represent is not like that at all. And I'd say try and give him a chance to see what he's really like. Our prayers are with the victims entirely. And what happened to you is 100% evil. And we understand your hesitation for Christianity or anything like that. But I'd say try your best to have it be that you were at one time in your life victimized, but you will not be a victim anymore. And any other woman out there, anyone else out there, there is always a way out somehow. You never have to be a victim, and you should never have any man force you to do something you don't want to do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, Nick. That was well said. And judging by people's silence, I think we are all in 100% agreement on that, because
Yep.
you said it as well as anybody could, Nick.
Yes, very well put.
All right, guys, I'm going to go for tonight. And if anyone wants to, Joe didn't give his before he goes, if anyone wants to see my stuff, I did do a blog recently on this. I've done a blog on the news after it came out, a blog after a report came out. You can find my work at deeperwatersapologetics.com. I'm there. I'm working on a YouTube channel, and I'm still planning on uploading our videos sometime soon. I had to move suddenly, so I put a kibosh on things, but I'm planning on it. But you can find me deeperwatersapologetics.com, and as always, I do affirm the virgin birth.
Thanks, Nick. Good to have you tonight. So before we kind of close out and finish out for the night, I want to definitely give people a chance for anything else where they kind of want to take this conversation. One thing I think we need to discuss that is certainly relevant to those of our listeners who are apologists and who may kind of already be in this kind of world, that you will, that we're within. There's the issue of what do we do with his materials that are out there. So his podcast, his videos, his books, how do we handle that moving forward? Is it something we toss? Is it something we keep but don't recommend? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I guess as a general rule, I'm sort of opposed to say book burning or book banning or anything like that, and always have the work judged by its own merits. But I can certainly understand the reluctance of, say, using his material. I mean, there's just like an element of disgust handling his work. Like I used to be a big Bill Cosby fan. It's like, oh, I love the Cosby Show, and when I'm retirement, I'm gonna watch his shows. And now, of course, I can't watch his shows anymore. So,
Yeah.
so I can understand the reluctance.
Yeah, I understand the reluctance too, and I've been pretty outspoken about like cancel culture and things like that. So as a general rule, I disagree of canceling people over terrible things they've done in the past. But this is kind of a special case in that all of this came out after Rabbi died, so it's not like he'll ever have a chance to publicly confess all of the evil stuff he's done, repent of it, and try to make himself a better person. So, I like Maverick Christian was saying, I too understand the reluctance, and I'm kind of in the same boat. I grew up with Bill Cosby. He was kind of my TV dad, but now that, him and Carl Winslow, actually. I'm white, but two of my TV dads were black. So, ever since that thing went live about Bill Cosby, it's like I haven't been able to view his material the same, and I can understand someone being that way about Ravi Zacharias. And so I would say, I think it's probably just up to the individual what they want to do with their own materials. If they own it, it's theirs to do with as they please. I can understand if someone wants to burn it instead of giving it away or selling it because it's been tainted by the evil that he's done. But again, nothing he taught was novel or new in any way, so you can get better, more sophisticated defenses of everything he taught elsewhere anyway. So I personally don't have any issues with just saying, if you feel that strongly about it, then get rid of his materials and, read, for the moral argument, read William Lane Craig or, modern Thomistic philosophers like Ed Feser, or, I don't know what else. I just know his morality material, but whatever else he taught on, there are better defenses of it out there, because Ravi Zacharias was a popularizer. He wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a philosopher. He was he was an apologist, someone who made a case. And now that all of this evil that he's done in his private life has come to light, that kind of raises the question: did he actually believe anything that he actually argued for or taught? So I don't know. But I think that it's definitely, at the very least, been tainted by the information that's come to light.
Yeah, it's probably it is a very unfortunate irony too that probably the vast majority of his speaking on subjects was concerning morality. That was really what I knew Ravi for, was his being able to clearly make distinctions and help people understand the difference between Christian morality. He when Ravi spoke to something, he didn't typically speak to issues of evidence for the resurrection. He never gave a defense of the cosmological argument that I recall seeing. It was always man's moral relationship to God and to the rest of the world. And, so to see him transgress what he taught on that is just, it's sort of, additionally heartbreaking. I will say, I took to the Christian Apologetics Alliance Facebook group to kind of ask about this, because it's kind of interesting. Clinton, you mentioned that Ravi was a popularizer, and that's exactly right. And that's evident in that, for me personally, if you look at my blog, way back when I first started getting into apologetics, typically you're more apt to listen to the popularizers first, and then you move on. I quoted Ravi a lot, and then suddenly I didn't really quote him at all. And that was because I had moved on from that material and got closer to the source of it, so to speak. And so nevertheless, I had some issues I wanted to work through. So I asked for the opinion of other folks in the Apologetics Alliance, in hopes of coming to a sort of disclaimer that I could provide on my old Facebook, or excuse me, rather on my old posts so that when people found it, they would understand that I have addressed this issue, that I have carefully thought about this issue. And I asked the question in a very open-ended way. Basically, I was like, should we cancel Ravi? I mean, because we're really sensitive. You know, Clinton, you mentioned this. I know I am really sensitive to this stuff with cancel culture and revisionist history, and this is not good. I was actually, I saw people on both sides of it applauding and also not being very happy with the decision by HarperCollins and by Lee Strobel to actually remove Ravi from the Case for Faith and to pull all of his books, etc. You know, I don't know where I stand on that. I almost see them as two different things. I almost see one as almost rewriting history and another one as making a decision based on the association. Obviously, you don't want the association of Ravi with your publishing company. That's fair. I don't know that I'm in full support, though, of Lee going back and actually editing his chapter out of the book. That feels, just honestly and openly, that feels more like the revisionist history that I am so very publicly and openly against in other areas of especially American life and politics. So
yeah, actually,
go ahead.
Yeah, and actually, I'm actually on the same page with you. No pun intended. But yeah, because I kind of am bothered by Lee Strobel trying to remove Ravi Zacharias from his book, because it almost, I don't know, because I mean, I have no issues with Lee Strobel. Like I believe he's totally genuine. I don't have any issues with him as a person, but it kind of feels like almost like you're trying to erase any affiliation you ever had with him.
Right.
It's like, Rabbi, no, I never, did anything. I never had him in my book or anything like that. It kind of feels like that, even though obviously it's not, because there are a lot of people who've read his previous work, so obviously he can't get away from that. But yeah, I kind of get that same impression that you do, Steve.
It does almost feel like taking an eraser to a history book.
Yeah, it does, and that's so that's where I'm kind of like, I don't know. That's so I approached it because I don't want to take an eraser to my history book, so to speak, of my blog. I mean, I could go back and I could take out all the posts that were about, because one or two posts were either directly about Ravi. I did a thank you Ravi post when he passed away, and that hashtag was trending. And I had one other one that really, I thought it was a really great distinction that Ravi had made about personhood and how that's kind of the key to objective morality. So I had two posts that were very heavily, addressing Ravi personally, but then a lot of others that just made mention to him or whatever. And so I was like, well, how do I faithfully, disclaim that I am not supportive of this person while still keeping the my use of his ideas intact, because I think they were sound. And so I don't know if this is the right way to do this or what, but basically there were over 50 responses in that Facebook post, and I read each and every one of them carefully. I considered, based on what some different people said, I came up with a disclaimer. I thought maybe I would just read that, and if anybody wants to object or come in on a point, cool. If not, fine. But I thought I would at least share this. This is helpful for me. Maybe it will be helpful for somebody else. So this is what I've already done this. I've placed this at the very top of every post that has anything to do with Ravi. And it's kind of long, but I think it needs to be. I said, note, it's with a heavy heart that I must acknowledge a tragic independent report, and I linked that, concerning evidence of sexual abuse and predatory behavior on the part of Ravi Zacharias. This man was a huge inspiration to me, as is evident from reading my blog, and the news was more than heart-shattering. Some ministry leaders have come to the conclusion that removing articles about and reference to Ravi is the right move. I have come to a different conclusion, and here's why. 1. Though I cannot begin to imagine the grief or pain of those who Ravi hurt and the emotional toll of his behavior, it is also the case that to discredit a piece of information due to the character of the source of such behavior is to commit the genetic fallacy. If I quote or mention Ravi, it's because I believe those items to contain truth value on their own merit. 2. To go back and change previously written information without a careful disclaimer is, I believe, a form of revisionist history. If a disclaimer must be offered anyway, I believe there's value in keeping the material accessible. So while I know it's a difficult ask to say, just trust the ideas and disregard his personal character, I must ask that of you as a careful thinker. Third, and finally, I've seen a lot of comparisons by Christians to not removing Ravi's work because biblical characters like King David and others had fallen into terrible sin, and they have obviously been given to us as a gift to learn from, Romans 15:4. Why cancel Ravi if we're not canceling the Bible? It does seem to me, though, that there are two problems with this line of thinking. One, these books are inspired by God, and thus we can trust his revelation to us. They were examples given for a purpose. Two, these characters also seem to show true biblical repentance of their wicked actions. Ravi remained unrepentant until his dying day. Therefore, I do not think these are one-on-one comparisons. I do not expect you to agree completely with this decision. I do ask that you respect the thought, prayer, and seeking of counsel in which I engaged regarding it. So that's a pretty lengthy disclaimer, but so people had some really interesting thoughts. One of the thoughts was, imagine trying to tell an atheist, this guy probably was engaged in sexual predatory behavior, but the things he says are pretty good. So just keep reading. It's in practice, we may say, well, to discredit a piece of information based on the character of the person who said it would be a logical fallacy, but certainly we can all agree that there's an emotional baggage that comes along with that.
Right.
And so anyway, any thoughts on any of that, or do you think that was somewhat appropriate?
Yeah, I thought it was fine. Because I don't think you have any obligation to remove any mentions of Ravi Zacharias from your articles, and I think putting a disclaimer up to explain why you're leaving it up there, I think it's very helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah, and David Russell left this comment that I threw up there a little bit earlier. Nothing can take away from the truth of what Ravi taught. David sent his friends to the front lines to die, yet we read the Psalms. So I think that it hits on your one point there, and it's not a perfect one-for-one comparison by any means, but it doesn't negate from the truth of statements we're given, and yet we...
Right. But Steve also addressed this in his disclaimer also, and that like you're saying, it's not a one-to-one comparison, because we know that the prophet Nathan confronted David with the sin, and David was immediately repentant once he recognized what he has done, and Ravi Zacharias was never publicly repentant of any of the things that he did. So while we shouldn't necessarily feel like we can't use any of Ravi Zacharias' material today, it's a lot less controversial to use the material that David wrote in Scripture because of his repentance for his behavior. Since he repented, we know that he was remorseful for what he did. He, didn't do it again, and so we can use his material because we're using the material of someone who understood, what he did and repented of it. With Ravi Zacharias, it's a little bit different because there's lacking that public repentance from him.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that line of thinking was important because I was compelled, just like David was. I was compelled by that initially. I thought, well, that's true. I mean, we're not hiding any flaws from the Bible. We know that what kind of people these guys were, but it is true that they were publicly repentant. It's forever inscripturated that they were repentant, and these things were given for our learning. It does seem like a different, and I've seen, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit trail, frankly, because I don't have time, but also because I don't claim to know the answers here. But I've definitely seen some suggestions by people, questioning whether or not Ravi was genuinely a Christian. And of course, we understand that our eternal destination is not judged by necessarily our moral doings. Absolutely. But you do have, I think in some cases, grounds to wonder, when you have a certain degree of an act that was done, especially when Scripture is misused in order to judge those things. I think there is a legitimate question about that. It's certainly not my position to answer, but most certainly, if there's a chance that he was actually not truly a believer, and that this was actually all just a charade, almost a front to be. And I don't want to. Again, I know I'm stepping on crazy water there. I don't want to believe that or think that. But if that's the case too, it's kind of like I think maybe worth giving it some even deeper thought as to whether these materials should continue to be used into the future. I know me for one, and this is where I'll shut up on this, but I will probably never quote Ravi Zacharias again, just because of what Maverick mentioned there earlier. How I'm always going to have that taste come right back into my mouth the minute I try to think of a quote he said, or something. I'm going to try, and it's going to be like, no, I can't say that. So while I'm not removing what's there, will I ever quote him again? Likely not. I'll probably never read one of his books again. I may, I don't know, but I'll always have that distaste. And that question even of whether or not whether or not he really even believed the things he was saying.
Right. And I think part of that too, I think I'm in the same boat with you there, is, there are a lot of people who have been hurt by this. And a lot of other people who are going to be hurt by this in terms of, their own personal experiences, where they're going to relate to something like that happening in their life or the life of a family member. And it does more damage at a certain point to, bring him in and continue to kind of give him this attention, even though he did say some very true things. But when it's this kind of predatory act, and it's got such pain and bad memories for so many people that are going to interact with that, it's just not worth it. As Clinton mentioned, there are other people who've said things that go deeper and that say the same thing, maybe not as eloquently as Ravi had said it, but we're not looking for eloquence, we're looking for truth.
Yeah, when I call Ravi Zacharias a popularizer, of course that's not intended in any way as an insult. I'm a bioethics popularizer. Frank Turek and Sean McDowell are popularizers of philosophy and apologetics too. Popularizers are gateway drugs to the academics, and often popularizers can put things in ways that the academics can't, because they're thinking on a much higher level, that it sometimes takes interpreters to take what they believe and what they teach and put it in ways that people can understand. And Ravi definitely had a gift for putting lofty ideas in ways that are understandable. As he's a popularizer, that's not intended in any way as a slight. But regardless of what Ravi Zacharias did, or anyone else for that matter, the one thing that I never say about anyone is, man, I wouldn't want to be that person on Judgment Day. Because the fact of the matter is, I don't want to be me on Judgment Day. So, I have my own stuff to worry about. So I try not to speculate on the eternal destination of others. It does raise the question if Ravi actually believed what he taught, because he wasn't consistently acting it in his private life. But it's none of my business whether he actually believed in Scripture, whether he actually followed Jesus or not. The only thing I can do is just continue on in my own life and make myself approved to my own master.
And I think that raises one other really important question that I think we're probably going to hear, especially as we get further out from this. But there's the question of what you hear, especially in relation to people like Ted Bundy, not to make that comparison, but Ted Bundy professed faith before he was executed. There's certainly a lot of reason to doubt that. But for somebody who says, you know what, you're a Christian, you've got this guy, Ravi Zacharias, who's done these horrible things, and yet a lot of people still believe this guy's saved and this guy's going to heaven. So that's a problem for me. So how do we respond to that kind of objection? Because I think we'll see that one come up again, because it comes up with a lot of people, and this I think will be a very popular example of that.
I don't know that I'm going to go through the whole thing here, but I did write an article. I think what you're talking about is related to the issue of deathbed conversion. Would that be a fair statement? Is
Well, even
kind of what you're getting at?
that would be one application of it, but more so this idea that, well, so and so is in the Christian camp, so because this person is in a Christian camp and is going to be okay in heaven, I can't trust any God that would allow this to be the case.
Oh. Well, I guess the issue there, I hate to go all Ray Comfort, right? But I get, no, I like Ray, but whatever. So I guess the issue there is so I had a similar question of this come up in my last days of full-time employment from my old boss. We were talking about this stuff, and I was like, the good news, because he doesn't consider himself to be a believer, but he considers himself to be a person who is morally upstanding, and in fact, he would consider himself to be more morally upstanding than some other people who do identify with being a Christian. And I was like, the interesting thing about it is that it's because of the gospel that our moral uprightness, it doesn't matter how good you are, if you don't believe, then you've missed it. So the issue is belief. If you don't believe, you're not going to be able to spend eternity with Christ. That is the name of the gospel game, so to speak. And so it's almost one of those things where the answer in one sense might not sound very satisfying, but whereas from a Christian perspective, there is no greater sin than denying the person of Jesus, than denying the work of the cross. It's in fact the only sin that will, send you to the bad place instead of the good one, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Like that is the sin that separates you from Christ and from eternal goodness and bliss and happiness with the Lord. And so, I think I'm not answering this perfectly here, but I think my response to that would at least be along the lines of understanding how good the gospel really is, and to say that none of us deserve. I mean, we all have skeletons in our closet. We all have things we're not proud of. We all have moral failings. Some, yes, on a level that is worse maybe than others. But the fact that any of us would be given the opportunity to spend an eternity with our Savior is itself a marvelous thing and almost unimaginable good. And so it's easy to point at other people and say, I can't believe God would allow that guy in. But again, the idea, and you're going to have that issue if you look back at King David. The issue with King David was not that he was a good person; it was that he believed. His loyalty was with God. And I'm not the expert on heaven. Other people have written a lot about this, but there are levels of reward that you will receive. If Ravi is in heaven, I'm a little leery of just using that sort of traditionalistic language, because I know there's new heaven and new earth and a lot of that stuff. But right now, if he is with the Lord or whatever, and into the eternal, there definitely seems to be rewards that some will have and others will not be at that level of reward. And so I would hate to be me on Judgment Day. I would hate to be Ravi standing in front of Christ. I'm going to loathe being me standing in front of Christ, because I know how little I measure up in comparison to the perfect Son of God. But His grace is big enough to cover. My pastor says it this way: His grace is either big enough to cover the greatest of sins, or it's not big enough to cover any.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think that's one thing that's often missed in answering that kind of question with people, is that there's certainly a lot of teachings in the Bible too that indicate that Christians should also be doing their best to live towards this relationship as it naturally progresses, to be prepared for it. We see with the parable of the talents that how people are treated. They're given more to manage, when they handle what they do well. So I think we certainly, that's something that's overlooked by people on the outside looking into Christianity is this idea that, what you do with what you have here does matter. It doesn't impact your salvation, but it certainly impacts how you move forward. And teachers are judged more harshly. And I think that's certainly something all apologists need to be leery of, because you're going to be judged more harshly when you're teaching, in the name of Christianity. Clinton, Maverick, anything you want to bring in here?
Well, I actually recently finished up watching The Good Place.
Oh, yeah?
Steve mentioned it in his when he was talking a little bit ago. Yeah. So.
I haven't started it yet, so.
Okay, so no spoilers.
All right. Maverick, anything?
I suppose there's this one thing we didn't talk about.
Now's a good time to bring it in.
All right. Well, it almost seems off topic now after everything we discussed, but one of the things they found was there was a touch of hope, which was a humanitarian effort on the part of RZIM meeting short-term needs for long-term gains. And I'm reading from the report here. We learned it was a purely discretionary fund with no clear guidelines governing how money to be granted. A significant portion of the wire payments from that fund went for the benefit of the 4 women, all of whom were at times Mr. Zacharias' massage therapist. And he used this thing to pay $40,000 for the women to attend culinary school in the United States. And each of the 4 women received monthly. So these are the people he was illicitly involved with. It's like $40,000. And that's just from one of the women. That's just for one of the women. So.
Yeah, I mean that speaks so clearly to the abuse of power and position, and even the monetary funds of the organization. How he was able to reroute it in a way that could be used for his desires rather than what it should have been intended to be used for.
What was the stated purpose of the charity?
I'll read it again here. Humanitarian effort on the part of RZIM meeting short-term needs for long-term gains. So it's supposed to be humanitarian. Clearly, a significant portion of that was not used for humanitarian purposes.
Okay, because that's still pretty vague to me. Like, what does he consider to be humanitarian?
Yeah,
purposes?
I think it was intentionally vague to cover up, shall we say, the less savory stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I just have one final question. Is Maverick Christian just a YouTube channel, or is your name actually Maverick Christian? Because that would be really rad.
No, this is my superhero name. My secret identity name is something else.
Okay, I was gonna say I hope you have a brother named Goose.
Apparently, I have to go back and watch that movie because I've heard a number of references to it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, they got a sequel coming out eventually. So
I heard about that. It's like so weird.
Yeah.
I've watched the movie before, but I haven't watched it in a long time.
Yeah. Same here.
All right. Well, anything else from anyone before we wrap up this discussion? We've certainly covered a lot here. I think we've covered a lot from kind of the apologist angle and people who are kind of in our field, if you will. I think it'll relate really well because we addressed those kind of questions that aren't necessarily addressed by something on the kind of popular level discussion of this thing. So anything else before we close out and give our little spiel of where to find people? All right. Well, thank you all for being with us. Thank you to all the viewers tonight. We saw quite a few of you guys in here watching throughout the night, so we certainly appreciate that. Please be sure to comment. Give us your thoughts. If we got anything wrong that you think needs to be addressed, please, throw that out there too. Would love to hear from you on it. Thanks for all the participation of everybody. You can certainly subscribe, hit notifications here on the Mentionables channel. You can find me over at Question Christianity as well on YouTube or Facebook. Clinton, where can they find you?
Well, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Gab, and you can find me on MeWe. So, if you have accounts there, you can find my personal account. And I also host a podcast called Pro-Life Thinking, where you can find a page for Pro-Life Thinking on Facebook and MeWe. We have an audio-only podcast, which you can find on iTunes or blogtalkradio.com/Pro-Life Thinking. And we also have started up a YouTube channel for Pro-Life Thinking, where we do a video portion of the podcast and then extract the audio, put that on the audio-only portion. But to get the most out of the podcast, you'll want to listen to the audio-only podcast and pay attention to the YouTube channel, because we have content that is exclusive to both. No exclusive videos just yet, but we're working on some of those, some training videos, because Pro-Life Thinking is a podcast that trains people how to make the pro-life case effectively and persuasively. And it's also the case that a very popular pro-life channel on YouTube was recently taken down by the powers that be. I believe it was LifeSite News. So there's always a possibility. Right now we're under the radar because we still have low viewage on YouTube, but we've started backing up all of our videos on Rumble as well. So if you go to Rumble, you can find us there. And eventually, if our channel becomes big enough, we might run afoul of YouTube and have our channel taken down too. So we are backing up all of our videos on Rumble as well.
All right. Thanks, Clinton. Steve?
Yeah, so you can find me. So I have a podcast and a YouTube channel and a blog. So you can find pretty much anything you want to find by going to either steveschramm.com or enduringtogether.com. You will just, again, redirect you right into my website. And that's where you can kind of find everything. I must confess, at the moment, I'm still trying to kind of, I've jumped around over the last 3 years on different things, that I was, really tackling. At one point I was really tackling the creation thing. Then I went heavy into apologetics. Now I'm more in the Bible nerd, deep theology kind of stuff, because of how well I think it even informs the endeavor of apologetics. And right now, fortunately, so I left my full-time job a few weeks ago. Well, I guess, it's been exactly a month. Tomorrow will be a month that I left my full-time job. And, my business has really just picked up. And so I've really been trying to navigate and figure out where to fit ministry work into my schedule. So I haven't figured that out yet. So y'all pray for me. I haven't been as consistent in my ministry teaching and things like that, but I want to get back to it. I really do miss it, but I need to do it in a way that's manageable and I can stay consistent. I may go back to just blogging for a while because it's easier to write than to get in front of the mic. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But anything that you want, you can find by just going to steveschramm.com or enduringtogether.com. You can find the Bible Nerd podcast on YouTube, Bible Nerd podcast, which is on iTunes and all the other podcast platforms. And then Bible Nerd TV is the YouTube channel. So look out for things there. Something's coming in the future. I just don't know exactly what or when.
Fair enough. That's how we roll here too. Maverick, how about you?
Yeah, you can find me at maverickchristian.org. My YouTube channel is, predictably enough, Maverick Christian. Should have another video coming out sometime this month, so within the next couple of weeks.
All right.
I got a little starstruck when I saw you on here, my friend. I really appreciate your work. So definitely, I'll say go check out the Maverick Christian. Some pretty good stuff over there.
Thank you.
Were you the one? I think, because I was reading a site where it actually talked a lot about logic and how to engage in logical reasoning. Was that your site that was doing that kind of thing?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I do have. I couldn't say, but I do have a few pages on logic on my blog.
Okay, yeah, I think I read your pages on logic. It's very, very helpful, very informative.
Do you have some? Sorry, I didn't mean to make this the Maverick Christian show, but I do have one more question. Do you have credentials in philosophy? Or am I thinking of somebody different?
I'm a philosophy student, so I'm on my way there. I haven't quite arrived yet.
Understood. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me tonight, guys. I appreciate it. Tough discussion. Glad we had it, though. Hope the listeners got something out of this. Please let us know in the comments what you thought, what you disagreed with, if any of it was helpful to you. Hope everybody has a great night. And
Thanks, guys.
I will roll the credits.